Israelis are anticipating a fourth election. They believe Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is pushing for it. This in a bid to escape giving up his premiership to his opponent Benny Gantz, as was agreed upon in a unity deal that established a coalition cabinet.
חלילה נגיע לבחירות, עוד יישפך פה דם ברחובות. ולכן בשעה כזו אני לא אתן לאף אחד לאיים על אזרחי ישראל בבחירות.
Israel had 3 elections after 2 failed ones, and after the third election, for the sake of forming a cabinet, Netanyahu struck a deal with his former opponent Benny Gantz. Under the deal, the two had to agree on a budget for 2020 by August, or the cabinet automatically dissolves and snap elections would take place. But for the sake of continuing the current status quo and keeping the cabinet, Tel Aviv postponed agreeing on a budget until December 23rd. Otherwise, Israel would have to have another round of elections, a fourth one. This is bad for Israelis because no budget means no to limited funding for important social and science functions such as education, and also it means a large budget deficit. Now, Israeli businesses and citizens are pleading with both Gantz and Netanyahu to put politics aside and think of the Israelis during the worst financial turmoil in Israel's history. 3 consecutive rounds of elections in April 2019, September 2019, and March 2020 failed to yield a clear winner. The current Israeli unity cabinet that was formed through intense political pressure has yet to agree on a budget. The power-sharing pact between Netanyahu and his opponent Benny Gantz stipulated that Israel would pass a budget by August 25th. This has been extended to December 23rd. Netanyahu wants only a 2020 budget. However, Gantz is insisting on a budget that runs through next year, citing previous agreements. He is concerned that Netanyahu plans to use this year's and next year's budget talks as an excuse to break up the coalition cabinet to avoid a transfer of power under their premiership rotation agreement. The longer Netanyahu can stop a budget from being agreed on, the faster there would be a fourth election. It is widely believed inside and outside that Netanyahu's corruption trial, which began in May, is a catalyst for the crisis. A snap ballot could lead to a delay in proceedings, and during the lengthy proceedings, many fear Netanyahu could opt to pursue a law to block his prosecution if he wins another term. This is exactly what Netanyahu and his right-wing supporters may want, according to the Israeli daily Haaretz. Also, Netanyahu seems to just not want to leave power, despite demands by Israeli citizens.
Obviously, he doesn't want to leave his position for 2 basic reasons. One reason is the court that waits just beyond the corner. We all know that Netanyahu is under charge of very serious charges, of 3 different charges, including bribery. And in January, the trial begins, and Netanyahu himself has to attend the court at least 3 days a week. He knows that. He wants to do whatever possible for him to, if he could, to skip the whole trial altogether. But even if he can't do that, so at least to be more powerful before, to get to approach the court, to enter the court with more power. Is that he wants to be a tyrant. Netanyahu, for many years now, has been doing whatever he could, whatever possible, to weaken all other institutions in the state of Israel. Whether it's the Knesset, the courts, the state comptroller, for instance, the general attorney, and many others, the media, everything. Netanyahu wants to be a sole ruler. He wants to be a tyrant. And that's the reason that he's been doing whatever he could in order to stay in Balfour. He's a megalomaniac. He really believes that nothing compares to him, and nobody compares to him.
מאיפה אתה, בן כמה אתה ומה אתה עושה בחיים?
אני חיפאי, בן 73, פנסיונר.
אוקיי, השאלה הראשונה שלנו, האם אתה חושב שבחירות רביעיות יתקיימו בישראל ולמה?
יש סיכוי מאוד. למה? בגלל המשבר הפוליטי ומשבר הקורונה.
השאלה השנייה שלנו, האם נתניהו צריך לציית לקריאות של המפגינים ולהתפטר?
הוא היה צריך לציית מזמן ולהתפטר מזמן.
למה?
למה? בגלל כל השחיתויות שהוא מעורב בהן וכל המשפטים שמתנהלים נגדו.
לפני כמה ימים היה סיכוי לקיום בחירות רביעיות, אבל אחרי הפשרה שהגיע אליה נתניהו והכניעה שלו לכחול לבן, העניין של הבחירות נדחה זמנית לעוד כמה חודשים טובים, אבל רוב הסיכויים שהבחירות יתקיימו במחצית הראשונה של השנה הבאה. ישראל עוברת הרבה משברים בתקופה האחרונה, ולדעתי הסיכויים של בחירות מוקדמות הם גבוהים מאוד.
כנראה שיהיו בחירות רביעיות, אבל נראה שלא כרגע, אלא בהמשך הזמן, אבל בטח לפני תום הקדנציה של הכנסת הזאת.
האם נתניהו צריך לדעתך לציית לקריאות של המפגינים ולהתפטר מתפקידו?
אני חושב שהוא לא צריך להקשיב לקריאות, הוא צריך מרצונו ללכת הביתה להתאוורר, לטפל בבעיות שלו, ואם הוא יצא נקי, שיחזור, ואם לא, אז שינוח.
The topic of a fourth election is trending on social media. Noga says that Netanyahu won't pass a budget because this allows him to keep the option of new elections open, but people are suffering, so he gaslights them with periodic stopgap bills. Luis says that, despite chatter, he doesn't foresee elections in near future. 64% population doesn't want it. According to Baruch, 3% of Israel's budget comes from the US, which also arms and trains all our potential enemies for free. He would be happy to see US aid withdrawn from Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. Yair says that, without a budget, the money transition is easier.
I came to protest about the occupation and about the social situation in Israel. That's very bad. People don't have food in the fridge. People don't have a job, don't have a future. So we have to make a change very quick.
I think it's time for Bibi to go away and leave us alone, and not alone, I mean without him, and let him figure out what to do with all these accusations he's got against him.
There are a couple 100,000 people that are protest against the Israeli Prime Minister. Not against the situation of the virus corona. No. There are people that demand that he will be. Tell them, listen. They called him not Prime Minister, Crime Minister. We see, Crime Minister. So they are against him, against this situation. They wanted him to say, listen, go to the judge, go to the courthouse. You have a lot of things to do there. Defend yourself over there, and if you will be in the end of it, up to you. But if at the end of it will not be convicted,
you can go back to dictatorial politics. But if you be, nothing we can do about it. But still, you can't run government and your trial.
Analysts believe that a new election and likely protracted coalition talks afterwards would have a crippling impact on the Israeli economy and further anger the Israeli people, who are not happy with the situation. The Israeli economy already contracted 28.7% in the second fiscal quarter of this year, the sharpest drop since Israel was incepted onto Palestinian lands in 1948. This while the budget deficit widened to 8.1%, according to the Israeli Ministry of Finance. Another election could make Israeli leaders prone to taking populist moves, leading to a loss in market confidence, a rise in risk premium, and damage to credit ratings. The governor of the Bank of Israel, Amir Yaron, called on the regime to swiftly pass the budget and warned that new elections would have a negative impact on the economy, which is already reeling from the coronavirus pandemic. The current coalition unity cannot enact rules or laws that can put an end to a growing deficit. The Israeli Finance Ministry predicts that the budget deficit for 2020 will amount to 14.5% of the gross domestic product if the situation continues until the end of this year. Over 150 leaders from Israel's business world signed a letter pleading with the coalition to relieve them of their financial hardships and pass a 2-year budget until the end of 2021. The letter stressed that the cabinet should not forget its commitment to the people. The letter stressed that politicians should make businesses and the Israeli citizen the priority rather than just fight over to be rulers.
Look, I must say that under this terrible government, the whole Israeli society, and mainly the poor ones, the Palestinian minority, the Ethiopians, and etc., those who belong to the ruled classes, mostly, and of course workers, women, they are victims. They are, to a great extent, I would say, that they are held as prisoners by the government and their own interests. So the Israeli society, or 99% of the Israeli citizens, are paying the price of the policy of this unfunctioning government. And so at the end of the day, elections won't do good by themselves to those citizens who, as I said, pay the price for the craziness or madness of the government, and especially the leaders of the different parties there. I hope that the results of the elections will change it radically. If the results of the elections will lead to an alternative, but real alternative. I'm not talking about a cosmetic change. There's no serious, profound difference between the Likud and blue-white. I'm talking about a real change. I mean, many people think, including many of the demonstrators nowadays against Netanyahu, which I totally endorse, But some of them believe, many of them believe that if Netanyahu himself is going to be changed by someone else, everything is going to be fine. No, that's not the case. We should get rid not only of Netanyahu, but of Netanyahu's way. Yeah, that's a matter of fact, there is a chaos. But one thing that our viewers should bear in mind, it is not only the failure of the government in managing the crisis. The COVID-19 crisis, the economic crisis, the social one, the political one, etc. There is a chaos. And the chaos is obviously a result of the failure of the government. But at the same time, the viewers should bear in mind that Netanyahu is interested in chaos. He's interested in chaos, and in that sense, he actually, to a great extent, leads the situation into a chaotic one.
אילו משברים חברתיים לדעתך מתמודדת ישראל? משברים חברתיים, פוליטיים, כלכליים?
בראשונה משברים חברתיים. המשבר הכלכלי בגלל הווירוס הקורונה, שאבטלה מאוד מאוד חזקה, מעל 1,000,000 אנשים מובטלים, עובדים מובטלים. איך הוא יפתור את זה אני לא יודע.
הם יקרו בחירות רביעיות. לדעתך מי יהיה אשם?
רק הפוליטיקאים, רק ביבי נתניהו בראשון ובראשונה, וגם גנץ. מההר נולד עכבר.
מדוע לדעתך עד היום לא אושר תקציב של 2020?
בגלל אם מאשרים תקציב, נתניהו הולך לבית סוהר בטוח. בטוח, כל דבר שמקרב את הבחירות הוא הולך לבית סוהר. הוא מעוניין כמה לדחות וכמה לתמרן בשביל שלא יהיה שום דבר. שיהיה תמיד תוהו ובוהו ולא תהיה שלטוני במדינה. זה משרת את האינטרסים שלו.
שביבי נתניהו יציית למפגינים זה חלום. אני חושב שהמפגינים צריכים להכריע אותו להתפטר. ההפגנות צריכות להימשך עד לנקודה שהוא לא יכול להמשיך למשול בגלל הלחץ הציבורי והמשברים שהולכים ומחמירים בחברה הישראלית, אם זה המשבר הבריאותי בקשר לקורונה וההשלכות הכלכליות של המשבר הזה ואחוזי האבטלה המאוד גבוהים בחברה הישראלית, שכמעט יותר מ1,000,000 מובטלים. זה דבר שמצריך החלטות לא של נתניהו בעצמו, אין לנו ציפיות ממנו, אלא אני חושב שצריך ליצור תהליכים מעמיקים בחברה הישראלית
אני חושב שקודם כל במובן הכלכלי ישראל מתמודדת כמו שכל העולם מתמודד, ועכשיו אנחנו יושבים במסעדה וגם ענף המסעדות והאירועים ועוד הרבה אחרים מתמודדים, אז בזה אנחנו לא שונים, אבל אנחנו גם מתמודדים עם אי אמון חברתי של חלק מאוד מאוד גדול בממשלה עצמה, וכנראה שבעיקר בעומד בראשה, ויכול להיות ששווה שתתחלף הממשלה הזאת, יחליפו כוחות, יחזור האמון, וכנראה שיהיה יותר טוב.
More comments from social media over the crisis. Daniel says Israel is implementing a second lockdown, which is going to cause significant damage to its economy. This is an example of a politically motivated lockdown, as there have been only 1,101 COVID deaths in Israel. Samantha says, it is important to remember when discussing this that society is not reducible to the economy, and much of the worst collateral damage from COVID-19 mitigation comes from unquantifiable social and psychological harms. They all add up, but count for nothing in politics. Aline says, Israel's economy will pay heavily for Bibi's lockdown retreat. According to Haviv, it's the coalition agreement. If the regime falls, Gantz becomes interim prime minister. Unless the cabinet falls for failing to pass a budget, then Bibi remains prime minister. So Bibi has refused to pass a budget, and Israel's most vulnerable have suffered for it for months. It's astounding.
In fact, I think the political deadlock is only partly to blame for the current situation. I think even if there was a functioning government, a government that was elected by the people, it would have probably kept the same, we would have seen more or less the same situation where there's a massive shortage in the Israeli health system to deal with a public emergency like COVID-19, because so much money is going to the illegal settlements and to the Israeli army and to dubious security operations, that the health system is under severe neglect, as is the education system, by the way, not just the health system. So I think that a major reason is the lack of governance. But even if and when there will be a new government, I find it hard to believe that they have the money to significantly invest in the health sector, because they're getting into deeper and deeper debt, and they have too many causes they need to pay for, and they cannot afford to pay sufficiently for all of them.
Amid a second wave of COVID-19 infections, where more people have been infected and have died than the first wave, public trust in Netanyahu's handling of the crisis has plummeted. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets demanding his resignation over the grave charges, which he denies. If a new election is initiated by the failure to pass a state budget, the public would overwhelmingly blame Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, according to a poll taken for 103 FM, part of the Jerusalem Post group. According to the poll, 68% of the public would blame Netanyahu and 32% blue and white leader Benny Gantz. It remains to be seen if there will actually be another round of elections in Israel. It's either another election or more of Netanyahu for now. Here is the news making the press in Israel. The Times of Israel. Israel's housing minister, Yaakov Litzman, resigned from his post in a protest of the regime's imminent decision to impose a general lockdown during the upcoming Jewish holiday period. Ultra-Orthodox former health minister accuses the regime of failing to act earlier and deliberately picking Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, as the start date of closure. Ynet News. Israel is in the midst of a second wave of coronavirus. This wave is even more deadly than the first one that hit Israel earlier this year. Daily new COVID-19 cases surpassed 4,000. Israelis blame the second wave on the higher-than-before death toll and infections on poor policies by the regime. Israel is now imposing another lockdown. The Jerusalem Post. Over 50% of Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox Israelis, say that they do not trust the regime. The Israel Democracy Institute published a recent survey that examines the extent to which the coronavirus pandemic has hindered the ultra-Orthodox community's trust in the regime. 53% said that their trust in the regime was harmed, and 53.5% said that their trust in the health ministry was harmed. Globes. The absence of a clear Israeli policy in light of the US-China trade war could leave Israeli companies vulnerable to US blacklisting. Tensions between Beijing and Washington are heating up, and the US has imposed sanctions on 24 Chinese companies involved in building islands in the South China Sea. The trade blacklist includes China Communications Construction Company, whose subsidiaries include China Harbor Engineering Company, which is building Israel's new southern port.